You are listening to the Sod Pod, brought to you by Grassland Agro.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sod Pod. As you know, topics on the Sod Pod are primarily linked to soil and soil health, but from time to time, we like to talk about something different when we get the opportunity. For this episode today, I'm delighted to be joined by Christopher Carroll and David Corry from Genus ABS to talk a little bit about genetics in the dairy industry and the beef industry, and a little bit about what their respective roles at Genus ABS entails. So, lads, thanks again for joining us on the podcast. And if you want to give yourselves a bit of an introduction there, that would be great for our listeners.
Thanks, John. I appreciate being on today. Yeah, Chris Carroll, grew up on a sheep on a beef farm in the middle of Laois. Went to UCD, was in the same year as yourself, John, and went into animal breeding in third year and just really, really enjoyed it. So I thought it was pretty cool the way that we could use maths and use statistics to figure out what cows are good and what cows are maybe not so good based on different traits like production, fertility, longevity. So did a master's then in UCD after with professor there, and then moved across to work for Genus ABS, the company that I'm with now. So they're based out of Cheshire in the UK, but they work across a number of countries. So we work with the US, Mexico, South American countries, all across China, Japan, and down in some of Africa as well. So I've been working now for 5 years, or just coming up to 5 years. Worked originally in genetic services, but recently moved over to the product development team.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. David.
And John, how are you? Thanks very much for having us. My name is David Corry. So I'm originally from Ardcash, County Meath. So from a dairy farm close enough to Tato Park. So yeah, grew up on a dairy farm, always had the interest in dairy genetics, and went on to study animal science like Chris in UCD, a few years after him. So after that, I did a few weeks placement with NCBC there in the lab down in Kildare, and I went on to then do a bit of farming out in Australia for a few months with another Irish farmer, Brian Corr, and then I've been over in the UK now the last 3 years, so really enjoying it. I started off on the graduate program in the UK, so that was covering every different aspect of the business. So looking at the Genus ABS side, the consultancy side of the business, and then I moved onto a product line team for 18 months. So that was giving me kind of an overview of the whole global business, supporting all our product line managers, looking at product performance, sales, inventory, and then recently I've stepped into a bit more of a commercial role. So the last month I've stepped into dairy strategy specialist for the GB team, so for UK and Northern Ireland. So that role entails basically working a bit more with the commercial team, supply chain, marketing, and ensuring we have the right product for the right customers. So it's exciting role, and enjoying the UK so far.
That's fantastic, lads. Thanks very, very much for that. Before we get into, I suppose, where we're at today and the current state of play with genetics, would you be able to give us maybe an overview of where genetics have been over the last few decades, and I suppose where they've kind of developed over that time, and what has changed?
Yeah, of course. So genetics, and what we refer to with today when we talk about, ICBF and the EBI in Ireland, when that all started was sort of at the time of the 60s, the end of the 60s, the 70s, and it's really been kind of in place since then. The last couple of decades, as you can imagine, we've really built out the number of traits and the number of ways we can rank bulls or that we can rank cows within our farms. So originally we used to look for those easy traits, and we would just look at milk yield and maybe fat and protein yield. But we've since moved on to look at fertility traits. Obviously, fertility plays a huge role in Irish dairy farms, as you'll know, John, from visiting customers. So there's huge emphasis put there into how can we collect enough data to record these traits, and then how can we build out the models to make sure that the information that we're giving out to our customers are as accurate as they can be. Yeah, I think that kind of summarizes where we're up to today. There's obviously a lot of work going on in the future that we can touch on maybe a little bit later, but yeah, making huge improvements. Genomic technologies has obviously come into play in the last sort of 10 to 15 years. Ireland has been a leader really in the schemes that they've put out, allowing a lot of dairy customers and a lot of beef customers to genomic test their cows. And we're really seeing this across all countries we work with. So genomic testing, we see it in the UK, the US, all through South America. Sex semen It's been around a lot recently, and I know Ireland is starting to really increase the uptake of sex semen, but we see that in a lot of other countries that we work in where maybe fertility isn't as important. So like the UK, for example, would be much more of an indoor type system. Therefore, the need to calve down a cow on the 1st of February isn't as great as what it would be in Ireland. So actually, maybe they've adopted sex semen a little bit faster than what Ireland has, an example. But yeah, a lot of interesting things going on the last couple of decades, and I'm sure a lot more to come in the future.
Very good, Chris. And Dave, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Chris. When, like, looking back when I was at home farming there 10 years ago, or when I started off and doing the breeding programs in my home farm, I suppose technology like sex semen was only starting to get introduced into Ireland and other markets. And then stepping into the industry and coming over here now, you can see like over 80% of semen sold within the UK. I think it's 84% is sex semen, so sex dairy semen. So that's gonna 90% guarantee you're gonna have a female calf. So that is a massive new technology that is getting really important in a lot of markets. Like back home in Ireland, I think sex semen usage is around 30%. But that is allowing farmers then to be more selective with what animals they breed for their future replacements. So that are going to come into their herd and then allow them to use more beef semen, which is getting even more important. We see in countries like Ireland where we export a lot of our produce, and it's allowing farmers to generate more income from those calves so they don't have that dairy bull calf, and then it's allowing us to be more efficient and sustainable, and so reduce that greenhouse gas emissions and produce more from less. So it's really exciting, and there's yeah, lots of different things happening within the genetics industry. Sex semen is just one of them. But it's really progressed massively since when we started, and probably after university coming over here, even in the last few years, the progress has been massive.
Very interesting. Thanks very much for that, David. And I suppose in terms of on-farm, then, like how important is the value of genetics and I suppose the impact they have on a farm commercially then?
Well, I suppose from my aspect, if we look at the average cost people spend on genetics, in the past, people would look at genetics probably as a cost, but it's a long-term investment. So it's one thing that you invest in that is permanent and cumulative. So generation after generation, you're going to get the return on that investment. But it's difficult for some people because it takes time. It takes 2 to 3 years before you can actually see that return on that investment. So there's tools which are helping us measure that, but the genetic investment is we're able to measure it a lot more accurately now. Chris will be able to touch on it a bit more on how we measured this, the genetic improvement we're making on farm. But in the past, people would have only spent, say, 2 to 3% of their total farm expenses on genetics, when in theory is an investment and it's long term. I think Chris will be able to touch on how we measure that genetic investment. But it's massive now. You're seeing like the production in herds across Ireland, UK, other herds, it's improving massively. It's not just down to genetics, of course, it's due to management getting better, new technologies, and better farming practices, of course, better grassland management, but genetics is another influence on that, on how farmers will be able to produce more from what they have.
So just to add a little bit there, I suppose top level line, we always knew genetics was delivering from an economic point of view. And like you'll remember, John, back in the days of UCD, when we talked about the EBI and we talked about it being an economic index. So if you select bulls with higher ABI, that was going to deliver you more money. So a recent study that always comes to mind when I think about it was work that was done in the US. And they started looking from about that 1960s to 1970s, when we started introducing these concepts. And they looked at the increase in milk yield in US dairy cows from the 1960s up until about present day. And what they found was about 50% or 55% of the improvement was just due to better genetics. So if you think about how the feeding has changed, how the management has changed, how the milking parlors are better from 1960s to today, for genetics to essentially take half of that improvement is a huge value that puts back to the farmer, isn't it? And to David's point, 50% improvement in milk for 1 to 2% of your total cost. So there's a huge return on investment. I suppose the only thing that's different from genetics to what feeding or fertilizer is, it does take that little bit of time to see it, doesn't it? You know, when you go out and advise your customers, John, they're seeing that pretty much in the net, 2-3 months sort of from when you make that decision, where with us it can take 3, 4, 5 years until they see that.
Yeah, so per generation it's lower, like.
Yeah, per generation it's lower. Like the investments, if you go out and buy a bull today, or if you go out and invest in sex semen, by the time you see that result, it'll be until those cows are first, second lactation. So that's really 4 to 5 years down the line, isn't it? Now, when they get there, we can show that they're going to have better milk yield, better fertility, better fat yield, and they're really going to deliver. But it's just that length of time that takes for the farmer to see it.
Very good. Very interesting, Chris. Thanks for that. And in terms of what changes you're seeing in terms of sex semen and genomic technologies through your company, like what are the observations that you're making? What are the kind of the changes that you've seen kind of over your time there so far in the company?
Yeah, so David kind of touched on it there a little bit. So the UK is the leading market when it comes to sex semen adoption. So it started around maybe 10 to 15 years ago now. And what was the figure David quoted? 84% of dairy semen sold is sex semen. So if you think about it, that's a huge shift in change, isn't it? That if you take it that 90% of farmers now are confident in that technology. And we're seeing that in other countries as well. So the US is a little bit slower to adopt it in some ways. The US is sort of split. On the East Coast, we have a lot of those smaller farms. And on the West Coast, we have some huge farms there. And it's those maybe larger farms that maybe don't see the value in sex semen as much as maybe the smaller farms do. Obviously, genomic technology has come into play in the last 10 to 15 years, and that's just like transformed the industry, and it will continue to transform the industry. So the index we have in the UK, for example, is called the PLI. So it's basically the UK's equivalent of the EBI. And since genomic technologies has been introduced, the rate at which we're increasing PLI every year has doubled. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So think about it. Imagine that from a fertilizer point of view. You could double the output. If you could double the uptake of nitrogen in a crop, it'd be huge, wouldn't it? And that's what genomic technologies has provided. What's helped as well in improving the genetics has been the competitors market. Genetics worldwide is a very competitive market. David can touch on it a little bit, but the companies are really challenging each other to have those top ranking bulls. And competition means that people have to be better, which means better bulls, which ultimately means better bulls getting back to our customers, which means better cows. So, yeah, when we talk about the future, maybe a little bit, these technologies like sex semen and genomics are only going to become more into the farmer's mindset as we move forward.
Very good, very good. In terms of breeds, then, like, what are kind of the prominent breeds then, I suppose, in the likes of the US, the UK, and where do you think Ireland is going in terms of like what kind of breeds are kind of going to be the ones most prominent going into the future?
Well, I can touch on that. I suppose across the globe, in my last role as an analyst, I was looking at different markets. So we were looking at, as Chris touched on, Latin America, India, US, Asia, African countries. I suppose in the UK market and Ireland, it's a bit different, but a lot of our sales as a company would be Holstein genetics. The Holstein breed has evolved massively. And I suppose there's no one breed that is suited to one farm. Every farmer is different, and every farm has different breeding goals, different environment, and requires a different breed to suit that system or to suit their input, etc. So in Ireland, the Irish Holstein Friesian is very well suited to Ireland, of course, due to the EBI, due to their grazing efficiency. I say in the US, globally, we would sell, I'd say, over 80% of our genetics would be Holstein. We'd also sell around a good bit of Jersey semen. And then in the UK, Jersey isn't selling as much, but in the US, we have some large accounts that have always been Jersey semen and or Jersey herds and still produce milk for those high solid contracts to create ice cream. So there's some big Jersey herds in the US that we work with. Other markets then like Africa, of course, and those other markets where there's, say, they need a smaller stature animal. The Jersey is popular there, but you can now get smaller stature Holstein. So the Holstein has evolved massively, and the average fat and protein and fertility of the Holstein breed has evolved massively. But then in some other markets like Brazil, Latin America, we also see there's breeds like Nelore and tropical breeds that also sell well. But Holstein would be the predominant breed across the globe, and Chris will be able to touch on the why behind that.
Yeah, it's essentially the whole scene has changed so much, John, in the last 20 or 30 years. I'm sure if you speak to maybe a little bit the older generation in Ireland, they'll talk about Holsteins not being able to get them in calf and how difficult it was to manage them in a spring calving system. And that's why, in fairness to Chagas, that's why we adapted our approach, didn't we? We went sort of for the crossbred approach, kind of started breeding that Jersey into the Holstein because that was what was deemed as the better fertility count, which it was. We saw fertility obviously improves massively, and we saw our calving interval reduce from kind of the early 2000s. And but yeah, the whole scene has changed a lot because as well as Ireland identifying that, a lot of those global countries identified it, and they said we need to change our Holstein, and that's why the Holstein as a breed now, it's no longer, it doesn't just do the one thing. There's kind of two or three different versions of Holstein, as David touched on. There's still sort of the high type, high kind of show cow, and we'll see a lot of that in parts of Canada and certain parts of the US. Think about like going to like World Dairy Expo and like breeding for kind of high type cows, and then we see kind of the medium type cow, which is a smaller cow but still very versatile in terms of how long she can survive and her milk output. And then the third one that David touched on is kind of that smaller cow. So yeah, the Holstein is no longer just the one type of cow. You can sort of pick your Holstein to what you need it to be. So it's become a little bit more versatile, which is a little bit challenging for the other breeds because the Holstein is starting to kind of span out and starting to be very good in a lot of areas now where historically maybe other breeds would have fared a little bit better.
Very good. And I suppose it mitigating things like lameness, boosting productivity while also boosting, I suppose, fertility and things like that. That's kind of key challenges to the likes of yourselves.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why, in our company, we breed towards indexes because customers, know that indexes are important. So it'll be the net merit or the TPI in the US or the PLI that I talked about in the UK or obviously the EBI in Ireland. So these are obviously created by scientists in the same way ICBF has scientists that create that, the scientists in the US and the UK, and they decide what is the correct weighting to breed a profitable cow. And while, of course, not every customer needs to select for that specific index. When David talked on like the value of custom indexes, farmers get paid differently for their milk, and therefore maybe the bulls they select should be a little bit different. But all in all, if we kind of breed for that, then the bulls that we tend to put out will tend to be good in these traits: the good lameness, good fertility, good health. It's not just about production. That's why I moved away from that, and that's why we've created like an index now that has a number of traits in it. So if you look at what Ireland are doing, like with carbon, for example, they put carbon into the EBI in the last couple of years. That just shows how we're breeding for the future, trying to make a more sustainable cow, and a lot of countries are following suit.
I suppose reducing methane as well would be another one.
Yeah, of course. So we
Yeah.
had World Congress last week or 2 weeks ago in the US. It was in Madison, Wisconsin, which is where we have our head offices in the US. It's known as like the Olympics of animal breeding. And speaking to some colleagues that attended there was still huge emphasis on methane, how we can breed for lower methane cows, but the topics are starting to shift in that we're not only just selecting for methane anymore, we're selecting for like a more resilient cow. Because as we know, farmers aren't actually globally, they're not necessarily paid for methane, are they? So why would you breed for something that you're not necessarily going to get paid for? Why not just breed for milk or fertility or lameness, like you said, John, that you can see the cost of it straight away? So what we're breeding for is more resilience. So if a cow gets sick or if she goes lame, how quickly can she come back to like full milk production? Because if we can minimize the time she gets back to full milk production, that's going to improve the total production or the total value that she brings for the farm. And it also makes a more sustainable cow, doesn't it? We don't want cows that are sick or we don't want cows that are lame. We want healthy cows in our farms because that's the message we want to give out to the general public.
Super, super. And I suppose, lads, like, where do you see genetics going into the future? Like, where do you see it going, we'll say, in the next 10, 15, 20 years? What will genetics look like from your own views?
But firstly, I was just going to say, firstly, I'd see there's going to be a lot more of an uptake of sex semen with like different markets. The use of the technology is becoming a lot more prominent, and because it's getting a lot more user-friendly accessibility to getting the sex semen. I suppose there's a lot more trust in the product now. 5 to 10 years ago, there was a lot more, even on Irish farms, stock bulls, and you can see the genetic gain we've made, and we're being able to validate that now with the likes of genomic testing, and people are getting trust in the product with seeing those animals come into the herd milking well and comparing them to, say, progeny off stock bulls, etc., and they're being able to get a bit more confidence in the product. So I would see the use of sex semen and AI in general, artificial insemination in general, increasing. And the likes of other technologies, so not just sexed dairy semen, we're seeing sexed male beef on dairy semen increasing in the likes of UK, because different markets have different values for the likes of beef animals. So if a male beef calf is going to get higher value than a female beef calf, and the uptake of male sex semen is increasing massively in the UK and other markets across Europe. But then, yeah, as we said, the use of genomic testing, I'd say, will also increase massively. It's giving the farmers a bit more confidence and allowing them to increase that selection intensity. But yeah, it's hard to know, because 10 years ago, I wouldn't have expected this rate of genetic gain and this rate of uptake across the industry. But it's really exciting. But yeah, Chris will be able to probably touch more from a technical perspective on some of those tools that might be a bit more implemented into farms across the UK and Ireland.
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty exciting place to be in. If you think about the amount of data we're now collecting from farms, and you'll know that, John, from when you're going and visiting your customers, the more data we have, the better decisions we can make. So one of the areas I see is for farmers to maybe be a little bit more specific about like what the right genetics is on their farm. Because as you know, John, when you travel around the country, farms differ whether you're in County Cork or up in Roscommon or up in Northern Ireland. And Ireland's only a small country, so for it to differ that much, and then if we think about how people are paid for their milk, there's different milk contracts out there depending on how much you're paid for fat and protein, and your breeding goals sort of need to adapt to be able to maximize that return. So that's the first piece. The second piece, I think, is feed efficiency. There's a lot of work on feed efficiency in this space. Obviously, Ireland's a little bit unique because we're very much a grass-based system, and maybe getting data on how feed efficient cows are is a little bit more difficult, and also the cost of creating that feed is less than what it would be in the UK or in the US. But in the US, for example, there's traits out there that measure feed efficiency. There's some larger accounts that have their own feed efficiency devices on farm, and they're collecting data from the farm, and they're asking us to use that data when it comes to recommending how we set up their breeding programs and stuff. So yeah, we're definitely going to see people kind of move a little bit in their own direction. If we look at what's happening in the pig world or the chicken world, gene editing is becoming very, very popular over there. The sister company that we're associated with, PIC, they've recently developed a gene-edited pig, which makes it more resilient to certain diseases. So who knows? Maybe we'll see that come into dairy. Obviously, the jury is still out when it comes to whether these are accepted in the general population. While that pig has been approved in certain parts of the world, we're still waiting to get further approval. But it's yet to be done the dairy side and the beef side. So who knows? Maybe we'll have gene-edited pigs walking around, or gene-edited cows walking around soon.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, lads. And just finally, to get into some of the commercial aspects of what you do, Chris was telling me off camera, David, that you work a bit with Munster and Progressive Genetics. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and what you do there?
Yeah, so I suppose in my new role now, dairy strategy specialist, I'm basically the subject matter expert for dairy genetics within the UK. So working closely with our sales team, supply chain, and marketing, but I'm also working with our third-party partners. So Solnua is the export arm, or they're owned by Munster Bovine and Progressive Genetics. So I work closely with them. So we're exclusive distributors for their product of Irish genetics in the UK. So I would work with them on selecting the bulls that would bring over to the UK for our customers. So we have, as Chris said, a wide range of customers across the UK, because different environments, down in Cornwall and Wales, they might be growing a lot more grass than some of those all year round systems. Up in Chester, so there's some spring block herds down there, and then there's herds across the UK that would be using Irish genetics. So I would work with Solnua on that relationship to bring across the same bulls that are performing well on those Irish farms, and then bring them into the UK. So we sell them to our customers then across the UK. So yeah, it's a great relationship we've had with them over the past number of years, and yeah, it's working closely with them to ensure we have the right product for the right customers over here. But we also sell some of our genetics into Ireland and back home as well. So some of our dairy and beef genetics, some of our beef bulls, our T15 range, or our British Blue range, like Moneyman, would also sell well in Ireland. He's one of the British Blue Bulls that ranks extremely high on your DBI or your CBV index in Ireland. So it's a partnership that is working really well for us. So we're selling their product in the UK, and they also sell our product in Ireland.
Very, very interesting, David. Thanks very much for that. Lads, we're pretty much near at the end of the podcast now. What we normally do for each episode is we get our guests to give kind of one concluding message that you'd like to give our listeners on the topic for today. So is there anything that you'd like to say, I suppose, before we finish up?
I can go first. Yeah, what I was going to say was, like, in the past, people would see genetics probably as a massive cost, but it, it really is a long-term investment. And as Chris was saying about the use of data, it's exciting to see the return on investment genetics has. So yeah, look at genetics as a tool to use to see that return on investment, because as we know, the industry is getting ever evolving the whole time, and we're becoming a lot more susceptible to challenges such as climate change. You're probably seeing it with grassland, etc. too. But genetics can be a tool to help combat that. We can select for those certain traits that Chris touched on, and look at it as as an investment rather than a cost.
Super, super, David. And Chris, yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, John. Again, appreciate the good discussion. I'll kind of just summarize what David has said. Yeah, encourage your listeners to try and get read up on it. You know, genetics can be a little bit of a difficult piece maybe at times to understand. There's a lot of traits out there. There's a lot of bulls that we market today, but it's worth taking that little bit of time to try and understand it, so you can be read up. You know, people can make decisions on bulls or for 1 or 2 days in the year, or the 365, and that can impact the next 5 to 10 years of the cows on your farm. And that's from a dairy and a beef side. So yeah, encourage people to get read up on it. And you know, there's lots of great tools out there, ICBF, Chagask and stuff. They're always putting out fantastic information about this as how you can get a little bit more information. So yeah, I'd encourage your listeners to get onto that.
Super stuff, Chris. Super. Thanks very much, lads. Again, really appreciate you taking the time to join us in the podcast. We'll hopefully have you on again to go into a bit more detail on some of the things you've touched on this morning, but that's fantastic. And we'll leave it there, folks. As we do always say at the end of every podcast, take care and farm smart and farm safe.